We'll start our journey into React Navigation by setting up a Stack Navigator. The Stack Navigator will hold the views, which we'll call here screens, for both the directory and campsite info components. This is how your app will work by the end of this exercise. You see that there's a header for the directory screen with a title. Then when you select a campsite, a new screen gets stacked on top with a back arrow that will pop it off the stack. To get started, we'll need to install the React Navigation library using the version given in the written instructions. React Navigation depends on several supplementary packages. The written instructions contains a single expo install command you can use to install the additional packages that we need for now. Go ahead and use that command. Next, we will need to update the main, directory, and campsite info components. Let's start with main. We'll begin with 3 imports. The Platform API from React Native, which we'll discuss later. The Create Stack Navigator API from React Navigation Stack. And here, at the same time, I will delete the campsites import, as we will no longer be using it in this component. And finally, we will import Create App Container from React Navigation. The main component will act as the central hub that creates and holds all of our navigators. Just as you might recall, the main component in the React course held all the route components. We're only setting up one Stack Navigator for now, and we'll store it inside a constant called Directory Navigator. Create Stack Navigator is a function, and it has one required argument called the route configs object. In this argument is where we set what components will be available for the stack. We'll set this to directory and campsite info. We could actually stop and finish creating our navigator here, but we're going to do some additional configuration via an optional second argument. One configuration setting is the initial route name, which we'll set as directory, so that when this navigator is opened, it will default to showing that component. Then an object called default navigation options, and here we'll configure the settings for the header. The header style, for which we'll set just the background color. The header tint color, and the header title style, for which we'll set just the color. There are other styles that could be set here, but we are only using these 3 to set up the colors for the header. You can read about all the other properties available to the navigation options object in the documentation. There's a link in the additional resources. Now that we've set up a Stack Navigator, we need to pass it to the function that we imported earlier called Create App Container. We'll assign its return value to a constant called App Navigator. Create App Container will return a React component that handles connecting our top-level navigator to the React Native application environment to handle some functions such as responding to the back button on a device. You will typically always wrap the top-level navigator for your app with Create App Container like this. We're now ready to update the main component. We'll be moving the campsites data to the directory component, so let's go ahead and delete this constructor now. And we'll be moving to having the navigator handle the routing to the selected campsite, so we can delete this event handler that was part of the old approach. And in the render method, we can replace these with the app navigator, which is a container for the directory navigator. And the directory navigator contains the screens for both the directory and campsite info components. And the last thing we're going to do is make an addition to this view style prop. Let me just change the indentation so that it's easier to see the new property. We'll add a padding to the top. And though we're not using an iOS emulator in this course, this will show you briefly a useful example. Now, while React Native takes care of mapping all of your components to both Android and iOS equivalent APIs, it's not always perfect. Sometimes there will be discrepancies between how things are rendered in Android versus iOS. So your app might look great in the Android, but have something a little bit off in the iOS version. So here's an example of how you might write code to compensate for that. At the beginning of this exercise, you might remember that we added a platform API from React Native in the imports. We can use it here to get the operating system of the device. What we want to do is have a different padding top depending on the operating system. We can use the ternary operator for this, and we'll check the condition, is the platform OS iOS? If true, then the padding top will be 0. If false, then we'll use this value that is exposed to us from Expo to set the dynamic status bar height. So if you have an iOS device, you could test this to see that the padding top is different on an iOS screen versus an Android screen. We're not going to require that for this course, but at least this shows you an example of handling conditional code for different platforms. Due to updates in the Expo SDK, since this video was originally created, we'll need to make the following adjustments. From Expo SDK 41 on, Expo Constants was separated out into its own library. So now it needs to be installed, imported, and used a little differently. First, open your integrated terminal in VS Code. Make sure that VS Code and your terminal are open to the new campsite folder for React Native. Then use the following command to expo install expo-constants. Go ahead and put me on pause for a minute while you do that. After that, let's go to our main component.js. We now need to import constants from expo-constants. Then we need to do just one more thing here. Let's go down to where we typed expo.constants here earlier, and we can just get rid of the expo.part part because we're importing this library now as constants. That's it. That's all you need to do. Now, because the rest of this course's videos were made with the older version of the Expo SDK, you will see in other videos the previous code that says expo.constants instead of just constants. Be aware that even if you see that in other videos, this is the correct code for SDK 41 and up. We'll be doing two things in the directory component. We'll be moving the campsites data into this component state, and we will be changing the way that the onPress event is handled to use the navigator that we just set up. First, we'll need to import component from React, and we'll also import the campsites data, which is in this shared directory in the campsites.js file. Then we'll change the directory component to a class component in order to store state data. And that means we need to surround everything inside it in a render method. Then we'll add a constructor in the usual way. And we'll add the campsites data to the local state. Next, remember how in the directory navigator screen, there's a header with a title? Here, you can configure the text for that title by using the static keyword. The static keyword is a JavaScript keyword that sets a method on the class itself rather than on the object that is instantiated from the class. But we won't dive into how it works at this time. It's being used by React Native to communicate this title to the directory navigator's navigation options. Next, let me take a moment to talk about something called the navigation prop. Let's look at what the documentation has to say about the navigation prop. It says that each screen component in your app is provided with the navigation prop automatically. The prop contains various convenience functions that dispatch navigation actions on the route's router. So because we configured the directory component as a screen in the directory navigator component, the directory component automatically receives the navigation prop and all of these convenience functions, including navigate, go back, get params, and more. So this is a very useful prop. What we want to use now out of this prop is just the navigate function. We're going to use it to route to a campsite when a user presses on it. So first, since the navigate function is all we need, we can destructure it out of the navigation prop like this. Then if you look at the onPress prop here, right now it's set up to use the props.onPress event handler. You might recall that this event handler is actually calling the onCampsiteSelect method from the main component. And you might also recall that we just deleted that onCampsiteSelect method in the main component. So we'll get rid of this too, then replace it with the navigate function. And we'll give this two arguments. One, the name of the screen to navigate to. And the second optional argument adds extra parameters to the route. In this case, we're specifying a parameter called campsite ID, and we'll give it the ID of the campsite that was pressed. So now when an item in the directory is pressed, it will call this navigate function from React Navigation in order to switch to this campsite info screen, and this campsite ID parameter will be used to pass the correct campsite object to it. The last thing we need to do here is change this reference to props.campsites to this.state.campsites. Since we moved the campsite's data to this component's state, and it's no longer being received as props. That is all we need to do for the directory component. Let's take a look at our app now. At this point, you should see the directory screen with a header, and you should be able to click on each campsite to be taken to a new screen, but it will be empty because we haven't yet updated the campsite info component. And you should be able to click the back arrow to return to the directory screen. We'll now update the campsite info component. In here, we'll also need to bring in the campsite's data as state data, so we will import component and campsites. Then we will convert the campsite info functional component into a class component. And that means we need to wrap everything inside with the render method. Then we'll set up the constructor just as we did in the directory component. And again, just like in the directory component, we'll set the title for the screen using static navigation options. Finally, inside the render method, we need to change how we pass the campsite object to the render campsite component. Remember that in the directory component, when we use the navigate function to navigate to the campsite info screen, we set a parameter to hold the ID of the campsite being passed. We can access that here through the navigation prop, which is passed automatically to all components that are set up as screens, including this one. We'll set up a const campsite ID variable to receive that parameter, then we'll access it like this. This.props.navigation.getParam, and then campsite ID. Then once we have the ID, we have the campsites array in the local state, so we can use our old trick of pulling out the campsite object we want from the array using filter. Then the array index of 0. Then instead of props campsite, we can now pass to render campsite the campsite object that we just created. This concludes the updates for this exercise. Make sure that your app is working in your emulator or device the same way that I showed you in the beginning. You should be able to select the campsite from the directory screen and see the details in a separate screen, then use the back button to return to the directory screen. And both screens should have headers with titles that are styled in this way. If you're using Git, this is a good time for you to make a commit. And we'll continue to learn about navigation in the next exercise.